everyone. Thank you for joining me. So today I really wanted to talk to you about books. So I have really been getting into reading in the last few months, particularly romantasy, but also fantasy, sci-fi, horror, and literary fiction. So I wanted to talk to you about the books I've read and give you my takes on them. Now, I will warn you, I'm a grumpy elder millennial. So I have been angered by some of these books. In particular, the books recommended by booktube or booktalk. So I went into the whole booktalk, booktube scene a few months ago, quite naive. I thought, if all these people like these books, they must be good. So I picked up a lot of the popular books that are doing the rounds. I will go through them, but some of them have left me sorely disappointed. Others have been okay, and then others have been like life-changing. So I will begin by talking about the books I hated. So let's begin. I'll actually begin with, oh my god. This is When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. So the beginning of this book is quite heavy. There's a whole glossary explaining all these terms that the author has made up, such as boggith, bound, eon. There are a lot of words that the author's made up and like inserted into this book. Some of which you probably didn't need to make up. There are already words for these things and it just makes it needlessly annoying. And then there's a glossary of the creatures, the characters, pronunciation guide. Then this first chapter was just painful. Look, I even started highlighting it because I was so hopeful. I'm like, okay, I've got to remember this. Kalis, god of aether. Bulda, god of ground. Molten moths. I couldn't get past the first few chapters of this book. I found it was just, even in those first few chapters, just full of so many tropes that nothing really seemed very original. And I know one of the reasons people love this book is because they think the world building is so creative. The authors come up with like almost another language to describe the creatures, the places, and yeah, I mean, that's original. But for me, just the characters and the plot lines didn't seem very original. So I'll just read a little bit of the plot summary. As an assassin for the rebellion group Fur d'Ath, Rave's job is to complete orders and never get caught. When a rival bounty hunter turns her world upside down, blood spills, hearts break, and Rave finds herself imprisoned by the Guild of Nobles. Blah, blah. So the first few pages kind of establishes Rave as this like snarky assassin character, and that has been done to death. So already it was not drawing me in. On top of that, a lot of the prose and the language that the authors used are heavily borrowed from Sarah J. Maas, and not even the good parts of Sarah J. Maas, but the really irritating parts. So if you've read any fairy fiction, you may notice that in some of these books they just refer to men as males, like there is a male over there, and that's what this book was doing, and it just feels ick. So I couldn't get past that. Also, the prose in general just didn't grab me. It just felt like it was trying really hard to be cool and edgy, and it didn't work. I think at one point she described her hand as a stabby hand or something. I think it just felt like this book was not for me, but I can see why a lot of people would like it. So anyway, it's a shame the book is so nicely designed because I really wanted to like this, but I did not. Okay, I guess I will now talk about a book that I did like. So this is Bitterthorn by Kat Dunn. I would describe this as a gothic fantasy, gothic witch fantasy with some romance in it. I loved this book from the first paragraph. It's quite rare, but sometimes I'll find a book where first sentence, first paragraph, I am hooked. And that's what it was like for me. I just couldn't do anything else until I finished reading this. And I read this in about a day and a half, non-stop. So I'll give you a little summary. It's not really clear what time this is set in. I mean, it's a fantasy world, but maybe around the 1800s, 1700s. And she's part of this royal family, but she's treated really bad by her family. There's also a witch in this town, and every few years, the witch needs to take a sacrifice or a person from the town. That person's usually never seen or heard of again. No one knows what happens to them. But that's what stops the witch wreaking more havoc. So sometimes with fantasy, it can be quite hard to emotionally connect with the story or with the characters because the world is so abstract. But with this, it really felt like the author put kind of a piece of her own soul into the main character, and it just felt very real. I'll read you the first paragraph because this is what drew me in, and it could just be me, but and the chapter pages are so pretty. Okay. I was born from my mother and call, swaddled in my unbroken amniotic sac like an insect encased in amber, and entirely apart from the world. I have, in all meaningful ways, been alone ever since. The doctor grimaced and slit open my cocoon with a knife, spilling fluid and meconium, and like a selkie, I slipped off my first skin to reveal another human one beneath. I love selkies. I don't know why. I'm just like entranced by the concept of a selkie. So I think that the selkie mention is what probably drew me in, which is a bit idiosyncratic, but anyway. The other thing I liked about this book was the depiction of the witch. It was quite unique in that there is some magic, but the elements that make her a witch are quite different from what I've read in other similar witchy books. This is a sapphic romance, so the female main character, their main love interest is another female, and I think that was done really well. The ending was quite sad. I've like bookmarked something that I thought was interesting. Oh yeah, I bookmarked this because it sort of talks about craft. So she says here, I remember my mother working delicate tufts of fleece into smooth locks of wool between two paddles as big as her hands and covered all over with metal pins. Then from this carded wool she would do some magic I never fully understood and connect the fibre to the old-fashioned drop spindle I carried with me still. A neat twist in the thread and soon she was spinning, the wooden bulb bobbing up and down as she teased her way from sheep to yarn. It was all magic, I thought, in its own way, the mundane alchemy of craft work, turning one thing into another, as much a miracle as the strange magic the witch wove with her wheel. So, being a crafter myself, I thought this was a really beautiful way to describe working with natural materials to create a new thing. So if that sounds like something you'd be into, I'd recommend this book. So next I will talk about Nettle and Bone. So this is a book by T. Kingfisher. One of the big drawing points was that it features a demonic chicken. I was like, how can I not read a book with a demonic chicken? Again, I was quite disappointed with this book. Maybe the first third I really liked and I got through really quickly, and then it just felt like, okay, just give me the dot points of what happens next because like I've lost all interest at this point. What I found really odd about this book was that the first chapter seemed to be a completely different world, completely different seemed like the author wanted to go to a completely different direction after writing the first chapter, and then decided to write a different book from the second chapter onwards. So we follow the main character, Mara, and in the first chapter, she's in this really sort of dystopian wasteland, barren world, and she's in a pile of corpses, and she manages to put together this bone dog out of the little bones of other dogs she finds and reanimates the dog. And then there are these like cannibal humanoids roaming this wasteland as well. Like, I really liked that first chapter. That's the book in the world I wanted to read about. But then it just becomes a completely different book. We never find out why there are these weird, like, zombie cannibals. I think it's mentioned there's a curse or something, but it's not really explained why there is this one pocket of wasteland. Like, the rest of the world, once she leaves that place, is completely normal and fine. I felt like I needed that to be explained. The rest of the book, it just felt very brief. Like, there wasn't much flesh to it. And I think that's because I've read since reading it, that makes sense, that it's more like a fairy tale or a fable style. It's not meant to be that deep with the characters. But I just found halfway through, I kind of got what the characters were about. There was not much more to them. And they're all kind of, it's a few characters. There's a witch, there's a goblin, the girl, the chicken, etc. come together, and they're on a journey to tick off a few tasks to save the world from evil. And it just didn't feel interesting enough to draw me in. It had a romance randomly in it that felt unnecessary, that didn't really add anything to the story. So I think it was fine. It was like readable. It didn't make me extremely angry, but I literally got to this, I don't know, 2/3 of the way and thought, just give me the dot points. You're not adding anything else with the characters at this point. So anyway, that is that. I feel like I should, since there were so many books I didn't like, I will try and intersperse books I did like with ones I didn't like. So this is Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries by Heather Fawcett. This was one I did really enjoy reading. So you're following a character, Emily Wilde, obviously, and she is researching fairies I think it's for a PhD or some sort of academic work she's doing. And there's one type of fairy she particularly needs to research in a part of this world that is similar to Iceland or Sweden. They live in like snow and that kind of area. So she travels there researching fairies, and it's about her trying to get along with the townsfolk. She seems quite neurodiverse, so it's sort of about someone who's anxious or socially awkward trying to enlist the help of others. And there's another character, another really annoying professor that joins her. Yes, I won't say anything else, but yeah, I really liked this. I think it was because the fairies in this book were portrayed quite differently to a lot of the other romance fantasy books, in that they were quite mischievous, and some were evil or wicked or scary. There was one scene in this book that I found like really scary. Well, not really scary, but compared to other fairy books. And I like that, diverse representation of fairies. It's not just like some guy with elf ears. Yeah, I listened to this on audiobook and physical book. So I'm doing a lot of driving for work. So a lot of these books I would have half listened audio, half book. With this one, the audiobook was narrated really well. I think the lady narrating it had an English accent and just like fitted the vibe perfectly. So this is part of a series. I've gotten the next one in the series, but I haven't started reading this yet. This will be on my to-read list. It does bother me that I have two different, like one is soft cover, paperback, one is hardcover, but oh well. Back to a book that I didn't like, The Spellshop. Again, this was a book I really wanted to like, and I even got like a pretty version with purple sprayed edges. This is a book that's also been hyped up on Book Talk. It's a cozy fantasy. So if you haven't heard of cozy fantasy, it's a genre where usually there's not really many conflicts that occur. It's low stakes, and it focuses on sort of slice of life. Is that what it's called? Yeah, slice of life sort of plot lines within a fantasy world. So I picked up this book because I read that it involved a sentient houseplant, a spider plant, and that was like what drew me in. I really liked the first few chapters, and then I realized I only really liked those because that was where the only chapters that had any action or tension. So I've concluded I can't read cozy fantasy. It's just not compelling enough to get me to keep going through it. Like I read about half of this and I thought, okay, I get what this is about, and I just don't need to know anything else about this world. Which is sad because I really like cozy games. Like that is all I'll play. So Stardew Valley. I feel like if this book was a game, it would be the most perfect game ever. With the talking house plants and the magic that she does in the book. I don't want to spoil it too much. But as a book, it just wasn't enough to keep me invested. So I did like the main character. She seems to have been also coded as neurodiverse. She's quite awkward, and she prefers to be on her own. Though I found it didn't seem that realistic to me because she was also just rude for no reason, for the sake of being rude. And then there's a love interest, and you can kind of, it's quite predictable. You can tell where it's going to go. So I think I can see why people would like this book, but I've just realized that cozy fantasy doesn't have enough tension or drama for me. Next book. This one like blew me away. So this is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is a classic. It was written about 100 years ago. It still blows my mind that this book was written 100 years ago, and it is like the characters in this book are so understandable. The kind of feminist things that it brings up are still relevant today. I just can't believe I haven't heard about this book till like a few weeks ago. This was another one that had me hooked straight away, and I read this in a few days. So this is a gothic romance, I guess you would code it as that, gothic mystery romance. And it's a book where the house in the book, or the setting, is treated like as one of the main characters. So you follow the character Rebecca, and she meets a wealthy man, and they get married very quickly. It's all quite overwhelming, and she goes to live with him in his enormous mansion. And this is a beautiful Gothic mansion. The gardens that surround this mansion are just described so beautifully. They're full of rhododendrons and azaleas, and the way they're described, you can really almost like smell the gardens. So the man's, her husband's ex-wife died a year ago, and it's a sort of about the repercussions from that, and something is also really quite off about the house and about the housekeepers, and it was just very compelling, and I couldn't read anything else. I just had to finish this. What I also liked was the structure of the book, so I'll show you how it starts off. So this is the first chapter. Last night I dreamt I went to the Mandalay again. It seemed to me I stood by the iron gate leading to the drive, and for a while I could not enter, for the way was barred to me. There was a padlock and a chain upon the gate. I called in my dream to the lodge keeper, and had no answer, and peering closer through the rusted spokes of the gate, I saw that the lodge was uninhabited. So the way the book's written is she's kind of reflecting on these events that have happened in the past, but then you like catch up to the present day, and then the ending, it sort of acts like a loop. Like in the end, I felt like, oh, I have to go back to the first few chapters, and now it all makes sense. I found that very satisfying and really well done. I don't know what else to say. The villains in this book is also like super cool to read about. Like the villain is sort of like a Professor Umbridge character that you kind of want to learn more about, want to learn why they're so bitter. So this one I would give 5 stars. Okay, I'll talk about a book that was okay, but not my favorite. The Witch and the Tsar. So I just picked this up from a bookshop, mostly because I like the cover. I'm a bit fickle like that. And I was also interested in learning a bit more about Russian folklore. And I heard this book was based loosely around Baba Yaga. So I didn't finish this book. I got about 50%, and I just found the plot there wasn't enough mystery or intrigue to get me to keep reading. I think the book was really well researched. So I've got tabs here because it's meant to be based on actual events. So it sort of follows a Baba Yaga, which, okay, that's not an actual person. What I mean is, what's it called? Not historical fiction, but magical realism, sort of set in a time that things happen that are in the book. Okay, you can tell I'm not used to reviewing books, so this video may just be a ramble of nothing. But if you're still watching, thanks. I will try and explain the experience of reading this book. So it's set in the time of Ivan the Terrible, which was a real person, but it's kind of retelling that history and then inserting Baba Yaga into that story. And you're following the royal family, and Baba Yaga is kind of helping Ivan the Terrible's wife. But then there's like a mystery around it because she's being poisoned. I'm not spoiling anything, by the way. This is all happening in the first 2 chapters. So she's being poisoned. You don't really know who's poisoning her. Like, I really liked that plot line. It had me hooked in. But then you find out who's poisoning her after like another couple of chapters. And I'm like, oh, well, I don't want to read the rest of the book now. I feel like it could have been drawn out more. So I didn't finish this, but I think it's one that I'll come back to eventually because the author has done a lot of research for it. Even with Baba Yaga's character, like there are points where she's gathering herbs for her potions, and the author's written in the back how she's actually gone and gotten these old Russian texts and found out what herbs were used at those times. So it's quite interesting. It's just I think just figuring out who's been the poisoner, I'm like, oh, there wasn't much else for me to read about. Okay. Oh my God, this book. If you haven't read this book, you need to read it now. A day hasn't gone by since I've finished this that I haven't thought about this book. So I went into it not knowing anything, and I think that's probably the best way to read this, just to go in blind. I can give you an idea of what it feels like to read this book. Yeah, so I'll give you a brief intro into it. So you the book opens with you following a character who is just kind of surviving in this really bizarre place. It's not ever explained fully, but it's kind of like a labyrinth made of ancient ruins, really full of beautiful pillars and statues, but also it's on an island and the tides wash in and the ocean is a big element of it. And there's a lot of there's a lot of questions when you start off. I'm like, who is this guy? Why is he here? What's he doing here? What? But you that's kind of what kept me reading the book. I wanted to find out more, and then it just gets even more and more weird. I think why I keep thinking back to it is just how beautifully the setting is described. Like, I want to live in that creepy labyrinth. And the kind of twist that comes up about halfway is really interesting. So I don't want to say too much more because I do think it's better to go into this blind. The way it's written is via diary entries, so diary entries of the main character, which I thought was an interesting way to progress the plot. I listened to this a combination of book and audiobook. The audiobook had the best narrator. I can't remember his name, but it was like perfect for this character. The only thing is it's probably not great for an audiobook because some of the diary entries that he's reading were just lists of like certain things, names, dates, and I'm like, yeah, that would probably have been better to read in a book. But yeah, so this was a 5-star read for me. So this is one I didn't like and didn't finish either. A Belladonna. So I got this one because it's big on book talk, and it was described as a gothic, witchy kind of fantasy, and that's what I like. I like gothy, witchy books, but it just felt like it had no soul. Like the characters weren't that interesting. In particular, the characterization of the Grim Reaper in this book really irritated me. So again, I'm not spoiling anything. This is sort of chapter 1. You find out that the main character can see the Grim Reaper, Death, and Death kind of follows her around. But the way Death is characterized in this book is just kind of like a creepy teenage boy, kind of whispering, creepy, like trying to hit on her constantly. And I'm like, why is it an ancient, like, character like Death acting like a slimy man? Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. And I guess, like, I understand it was maybe like a tongue-in-cheek characterization of the Grim Reaper, but I just didn't feel like it was done well. A book that does do that well is The Hogfather by Terry Pratchett. So I think that's the best, like, funny representation of the Grim Reaper I've read in a book. So if you haven't read The Hogfather, that was my first Terry Pratchett book, so it was a good one to start with. You don't really need to know anything about the world, but in The Hogfather, Santa Claus is kidnapped or is missing or something, and the Grim Reaper has to take over that role. But that, like, funny characterization in that book was perfect. In here, it just didn't make sense. Okay, this book is amazing. I don't even know how to describe this. So this is Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergei Dyachenko. So they're Ukrainian writers, and the book was originally written in Ukrainian, but then translated into English. So this is another book I went into blind, and I think that's the best way to go into this, and also because I can't even explain what it's about. So I've heard it described as being a cross between Harry Potter and The Metamorphoses by Franz Kafka. So, the book where the man wakes up and he's a cockroach. And I was like, that is so insane. How do those things... Anyway, that's the perfect description of this book. But I would also throw in maybe some 3-body problem as well. So it's kind of a dark academia book, but it's so much more than that. I felt like like I've heard this being described as a book that'll change your brain chemistry, and that's definitely what it felt like. Like my mind was going places it has not been in, ever. Like there were thoughts I was thinking that I had never thought in my life, and this book, like the things that the character is kind of studying in this odd. See, I don't want to spoil it too much, but I'm just saying, yeah, this book is mind blowing. Much like this picture, this is also a great representation of what you would feel like reading this book. I don't know if I can even tell you anything useful about the plot because it's really good to go into this with nothing. And the translation is fine. Like it's really, it still flows really well. And it's set in Ukraine, which is an unusual setting. I don't think I've read many books that like set in Ukraine before. 5-star read for me. It's part of a series. See, I'm not even finished it yet. I'm almost finished, but there's 2 other books in the series, which I'm also excited to read. I didn't even want to talk about this, but I've got it now. So, The Ever King. So I really got into romantasy after I read A Crown of Akatar, A Court of Thorns and Roses. So that was the first romantasy series I read, and I was like, wow, what is this world? I've never read anything like this. But then since then, I bought all these romantasy books. So I'm like, oh, I'm sick of these now. So this was actually not one of the worst ones I read, The Ever King. So this kind of describes a story about, oh God, I'll just read you the back. The Ever King. They stole his crown, so he stole their daughter. For years, Eric, the scarred king of the Ever Kingdom, has thought of nothing but vengeance against the man who killed his father and trapped him beneath the waves. When his enemy's daughter unwittingly breaks the chains on the Ever, and Eric plans to toss her... Oh my God, I can't read today. All right, I do remember what it's about now. So it's kind of like a retelling of The Little Mermaid, very loosely. There are these 2 warring fairy clans, I don't know what you call fairy courts. One, they're kind of like pirates, and that's where Eric comes in. He's the leader of that kind of pirate group. So he's trying to get vengeance for some incident that happened in a war a while ago. Kidnaps the daughter of the Earth Fae, which is the other group. Romantasy happens. It was okay. It was a book. It wasn't too annoying. Oh, the thing that annoyed me, this edition I got had like random pictures throughout, but the pictures were very inconsistent. So I saw this one and I'm like, okay, I guess that must be Eric and I've forgotten the girl's name. What's her name? They also call them, so he's meant to be Serpent. She's Songbird. That's also something that's a bit ick when they have like little pet names. But anyway, so that's the 2 main characters. But then later, they look completely different. I'm like, these are not the same people. That doesn't look like the same guy. Like, what is going on with these images? Yeah, that's... And this one. That does not look like the same person on this first page. I don't know what's going on with this. Why this even needed to be illustrated. Doesn't help. So I'll give this maybe a 3 or 2.5. But like I get the appeal. You like I do enjoy coming home after a stressful day and just reading something that flows and is easy and predictable. So it's good for that, I'd say. What else have I got? Oh yeah, so this is another book I read after I finished the Akatar series, and I was like, I must read something similar. So this is A Court This Cruel and Lovely by Stasia Stark. So I also listened to an interview by this author before I read the book, and she also seemed really nice. I think she also worked in health, some sort of health field, and the way she wrote this book was in between work and looking after her kids. I think this was her, or maybe I'm confusing her with the Moonhatched author, but anyway, I read about her and I was really excited, but the book was okay. Like, it didn't blow me away. What I did like about it is, so I like when fantasy books have maps, but in this map, I could actually follow the character along. I was like, oh, she's here now. Oh, now she's here. And when normally, like, the maps they put in these books are like complicated and make no sense, but that was nice to follow Priska, the main character, along. There was something that really annoyed me in the end of this book, though. Oh, maybe there are a few things. I didn't like the male main character. He was just didn't have any personality and was just a jerk for no reason. And then there's this scene in the end of the book where, so the female main character Priska is like a beautiful blonde fairy. I think they even had a picture. Yeah, I really don't like it when they just draw pictures. It kind of ruins my imagination. Where is it? So this is another book where they've just decided to illustrate one of the scenes randomly. I'm like, what is that facial expression? But anyway, so that's the main female character. And in this scene at the end, she has to, I don't know if this is even a spoiler. If you don't want this spoiled, it's not even a plot point, but whatever, skip ahead if you don't want to hear this. There's a part she has to change her appearance and have brown hair. And then the guy is like, wow, you're even beautiful with dark hair. Oh my God. Well, it's just annoyed me. Like, it's very blonde centric. But I get annoyed by like silly things like that. So that's why I won't be reading any more in this series. Next book, The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. So this book has gotten really good reviews. It's been described as the female version of Lord of the Rings. So I was very intrigued to pick it up and read it. But I couldn't finish it. So I read about halfway and I was like, I don't care about this anymore. I don't care about the characters. I don't care about the plot. Why am I still reading this? Like, maybe I'm just very not easy to, what's the word? See, like all right, I'll explain why I didn't like it. Then that might be a bit more helpful. So you're following several characters, and there's multiple points of view in this book. I think that was one of the downsides for me. Like, I only cared about one of the characters, Ead. I think that's how you say her name, Ead. Like, I really liked her story, and I wanted to know what was going to happen in that particular story. But then there's like two stories coming from men that are kind of the same. Like, they sound really dull, and I don't really care about their quests or whatever. And then there's another female character, Tane, and her story's okay. But I really just wanted to follow the main one. And to get to that main one, you got to go through all this other filler. I really liked the world, and the dragons in this book talk, and I thought that was cool. But like, I've heard this being described or criticized for having too much filler, and that's what it felt like for me. Like, a character would look at something and then be like, that reminds me of this thing that I know about. And then I think the author uses that as a chance for world building and just inserts these facts in there about a random thing in the world, like a market that happens every 10 years. But it didn't, like, I don't need to know this. It's probably never going to come up again. It just kind of bogs the story down. And similarly, there's characters that are introduced in the beginning that seem really interesting. And I'm like, oh, I want to know more about this rivalry. Why don't these characters get along? So that was in the Tane's plot. There's some rival guy in the dragon school she's in. But then you never like hear about it again. And I know I haven't finished the book, but I've heard from other people that you don't hear of that again. That's a criticism. So yes, there are a lot of people that do like this book, and so maybe if my attention span wasn't so short, I would finish it, but there was just not enough in it for me to keep reading. Fourth Wing. I feel very conflicted about this book. So I started reading it, and like this, if you haven't heard of this is a very popular romance fantasy book. Everyone loves it. I started reading it. I was like, oh yeah, okay, this is good. I want to keep reading this. It's very readable. It's written completely different to something like this. This is like a high fantasy written in good quality prose. Everyone talks fancy. This book is written in easy to read prose, but still like not at the level of where's that? I have a pile of books here that you can't see, but when the moon hatched, the prose there was like conversational language. This is fancy court language, and this is in between. So like it's easy to read. The story was intriguing. It sounds like it's there's a dragon school and there's dark academia elements and romance elements. But then I read a bit about the author. I probably shouldn't do that. That kind of ruins books for me, and I just didn't feel like I wanted to read a book. Like, I'll show you what I mean. So the first bit is like Rebecca Yarros, blah, blah, blah. She loves military heroes. Well, who loves military heroes? Okay, I'm being quite judgmental, but I'm very anti-war. And here's this. The dedication is like, to Aaron, my own Captain America. Captain America, what? So I just couldn't get, the dedication was just annoying me, so I couldn't get past the first few chapters. I might come back to it. I probably don't need to be this harsh on someone I don't even know, but, and also the annoying thing is I bought like 2 copies of this book because I bought this one first, and I'm like, this writing is too small for my old eyes. I got the bigger version. Now I have 2 versions of a book that I feel like I don't want to read. Yeah, that's a problem for another. Okay, so I'll finish on a book that was a 5-star amazing read for me. So this is Stillborn by Guadalupe Nettle. This is obviously, well, maybe not obvious, but like, I guess with a name like Stillborn, it's not a romance fantasy book. It's a fiction book, and it explores themes of motherhood. And I found this book was amazing. So it follows 2 characters. One is a woman that doesn't want to have children and kind of exploring her thoughts around that. And she's friends with the other main character in this book, who becomes pregnant, but finds out her child has this, is going to have this genetic defect. And it's about both of them kind of grappling with their thoughts on that. It's so hard to describe these books because it's so much more than the plot line dot points I'm giving you. It's more like, I like this because of the depth of like the thoughts the characters had in this book were just so interesting, and I wanted to keep living in their head and hearing their thoughts of what was going on. I'll read you the first bit. Oh, this first page is just amazing. Like, this is what hooked me in. I don't know if I should read it to you. It's quite long, but it's sort of describes how I felt when I had a baby I knew I was responsible for, and it was so terrifying, and just the bizarreness of that experience. And that's also kind of what this book covers. I also like this book because there's some pigeons in it, weirdly. So the character that doesn't want children, she lives in an apartment, and some pigeons come onto her balcony and they end up building a nest. And she's really annoyed because there's bird poo constantly under this nest. So she's always clearing away the poo, and then she's just, on one occasion, gets so annoyed she destroys the whole bird nest. But the birds remake the nest, and something odd happens. Like, I don't want to. I feel like I'm spoiling it, but like, it's a very specific bird-related spoiler. So if you're like a bird nerd like me, maybe you want to discover this on your own. What happens to this nest? But it becomes like a nice metaphor for what happens in the story as well. So the second character in this book, who's pregnant, she finds out her child will most likely be born with this encephaly, and that's like an extremely rare genetic disorder where the baby is born with the brain isn't developed, so their head is very small, the brain is very small, and the chances of survival are very low. So I haven't ever seen that characterized in a book before, and I thought it was done really well. And it just brought me back to medical school because where I went to medical school, we had what was called a pathology museum, where they literally just had jars of dead things from people or organs. It was a very old pathology museum, so I think it was like at least, I don't even know, some of the specimens were like 100 years old. So they'd have like a foot of a soldier that had trench foot, and that would be the thing in the jar. I'm sure you couldn't do that today. But I guess you could, but what would you achieve from that? And then there was a section that I remember that was really creepy, and they were just like babies with different deformities, and one of the babies had lysencephaly, and that kind of stuck with me. It was quite kind of, that was the most disturbing thing in the pathology museum, just that these babies were still here in a jar. Like, why are they in this building? It just didn't feel right. But I hadn't thought of that for years, and then this book reminded me of that. But aside from that, I found this to be a like really good read. Yes. So I think that is it for today. Um, Let me know what you think if you're interested in hearing more about my book takes. Um, if you've read any of these books and you think differently, I'd love to hear that too. Give me your reasons why you did like or didn't like the books I'm talking about. Yeah, excited to hear from you, hopefully.